See, that was something that I was not aware of.
Just want to be vulnerable about my lack of attention sometimes when I was trying to figure out, is his left my left? No, I don't. Wait. No, that's on his right. Okay, yeah, so they're backwards.
I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. I need to be more careful when I put my headphones on.
No, it's all good.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations.
Kind of like yeah. Good morning, Justin. It's kind of like the gong in therapy or something like that. Yeah, or yoga. It's like yeah. Either way.
That's our gong, a clap.
Let's just let the segment begin.
That's right. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Justin.
How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Good.
I am excited.
Why?
I'm excited about our topic today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too. It's a good one.
It is.
It's an important one.
It is.
I mean, I guess I like to think all our topics are important.
Yeah, but I think there are those that you just feel connect more with the heart of who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I respect the fact, some of our topics are maybe a little more relative, but I think this one is specific to each and every one of us.
Yeah, you can't really get away from this topic.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. You can, but it will have a cost.
That's right.
And therefore, we're talking about vulnerability today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so as we think of the word, just the word itself, I realize we've kind of looked into this a little bit, but if you were to kind of think back, and someone said vulnerability, what would come to mind for you?
I mean, prior to the quote unquote research we did, was just watch a Brene Brown video that you will definitely link to. But, I think of honesty, transparency.
Sure.
That's a word we would use a lot in Celebrate Recovery for sure, right? Transparency.
Sure.
Yeah, probably those two would be the first ones that come to mind before some of the words she used.
Sure. And I guess in some ways, would you describe those words as comfortable or uncomfortable?
Oh, uncomfortable. Yes.
Okay.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely uncomfortable, at least when you're learning,
Sure. Yeah. I think there's something to be said for learning the benefits of living in a vulnerable way. Mm-hmm. And I think so often, I mean, I deal with this a lot, because it was funny, she had her 3 C's, and I've talked about my 3 C's before.
Which are?
Mine?
Yeah.
Creating a context for change,
right.
Challenging patterns and cycles,
right.
Which is where vulnerability comes into play.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And then consolidation.
Yeah.
And so, those are the way we challenge patterns and cycles. And I think building or developing vulnerability is one of those patterns and cycles that we need to challenge because we're able to recognize, okay, something does need to change.
Yeah.
Because why is it that whenever, emotions come to the forefront of a relationship, I tend to distance or I tend to be hurt. And then what do I do from there? And it's just kind of, that's where the vulnerability. And so I think so often when I ask people, because I'll talk about vulnerability, and when I ask people, vulnerability is synonymous with like nakedness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I think it has that context for us. And, and so when we think about, what nakedness is like, it's definitely a vulnerable thing. And, it's just, and I recognize there are people who can be emotionally naked with us. And there is a part of that just draws us to them.
Right. It's
It's a source of connection.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's truly removing what's between us. Right.
Yeah. And it's very similar, or what you shared. It's authenticity.
Yeah.
And it's like at that point when we are naked, there are no masks.
Right.
And so often in our culture and in our relationships, there's, I think there's levels of masking, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that was said in the video talked about, kind of our desire, our view of who we are versus who we really are, and kind of talked about how that can never work when you're trying to live in this projection of yourself.
Sure.
It never work in terms of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And it's such a good point, because while you got those masks on, it's pretty hard to be real.
Yeah.
It's by very definition not real.
Sure.
Right?
And I think we all have these moments where I want someone to think I'm this when I know that I'm not that. I know I'm something different. And yet I want you to think, I guess in some ways I need to make that a little more simple. I want you to think I'm A when I know I'm B. And therefore, it becomes difficult to be able to be vulnerable or transparent or authentic in those moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, this would be a question for you as a therapist, right? As a counselor. Have you found that it is in any way possible to make headway in terms of therapy as a patient, right?
Okay.
Without vulnerability? Is it possible to...
Yeah, I mean, I'll honestly think about that to answer it, but I would say no. Yeah. Because I think that is a part of the beginning steps of going into therapy. And that's where I would come back to that first C, creating a context for change. So when I'm going into a therapist office, and I'll definitely deal with this more so like with my adolescents and so forth, because I'm encouraging them, because so often, we tell people what they want to hear, especially if we've been kind of badgered to a certain degree.
By we, you don't mean the counselor, you mean just us people.
Yeah, people in general.
Yeah.
My clients, and and especially kids, it's like, well, they'll come out, I'll encourage them to be honest with me, because I can't really help them unless they are.
Yeah.
And so I use that word honesty, but I think that is a part of vulnerability, because unless I really know what's going on, including your reaction, there really isn't that transparency. There isn't that opportunity for change, because I'm just another person that you're interacting with like every other person. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason you're coming to see me.
Yeah.
So yes, I would dare say without that, there is not, the ability to change. And that's where I think, on my part, it is about creating safety to be vulnerable. What do you need from me?
Right.
What, if my tone comes off in a certain way, my body language is offensive.
What if they said it was your beard? Then what would you do?
Yeah, we'd have to talk about that. What is it about my beard? Yeah. Because, that's...
Do you need me to shave it?
No, I don't. Your beard looks just fine, Justin. No, but I understand what you're talking about. Yeah.
Totally teasing.
Well, and yet it could be something like that would keep somebody, because I have a perception that to them that could be very similar to another incident where, they were just completely scared.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's going to be counter to, and we're going to have to relearn, that it's not the beard, it's the person behind the beard. Right. And so everyone who has a beard isn't a terrible, nasty person who's going to hurt me.
Right.
So that's, yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
I appreciate the question though.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we're thinking about the segment, if you will, what would you care to share the other 3 C's that Brene shared? You remember those?
Yeah, I remember them, and then I'm looking at my notes I wrote down. Does that count?
Oh, of course.
Yes. She talked about courage and compassion and connection, and I think they were kind of steps, right? Courage translates, will And what she described courage, do you remember how she described it? She kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was basically in the old English, it came in as cur as the word, but it had to do with a wholeheartedness.
Yeah.
And that's, she opposed it to bravery, or defined it differently than bravery, because it isn't just what I'm doing. It's about who I am and what I bring, and I bring a wholeheartedness. And because bravery can be another mask as I see it.
Yep.
But courage is the ability to bring who I am and my fullness thereof. And, and we can think of every great movie, that's what comes to mind for me, where I think about bravery, but then I think about, those people who really had courage. And part of that is just bringing who they are, those Braveheart moments,
basically,
it's like, you can leave if you want.
Yeah.
But, we're here right now, and now's the opportunity. And if you bring all you are, that's what I think, that's the part of vulnerability, courage, connection. I'll bring it back to God, because that's all he desires from us, is the vulnerability to say, hey, God, this is all that I am. And strengths and weaknesses, I give it to you to use. And I think that's part of that. I wouldn't necessarily call Wild at Heart guy, John Eldridge, he would call that like a sacred romance type thing, where there's this desire for connection. And I think that's a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, I had a train of thought.
I apologize.
Don't apologize. I think before we get to those 3 C's, she was essentially saying, vulnerability is kind of the key, right?
Sure.
If I recall, but she was saying there's one thing that will prevent using that key. Do you remember what that was?
And it was shame.
Yeah, shame.
Yeah.
And so I think, especially being involved with recovery for so many years, like,
sure,
shame is, in my opinion, number one enemy, not the addiction.
Sure.
Now, there's some caveats there, right? Like, if you're in active addiction and you want to stop active addiction, then the first thing you have to do is stop, right?
Sure.
So, and then work on shame. But the point is, shame will keep bringing you back to it. It will draw you back into previous habits, and what shame will tell you, you're not good enough for the change that you're trying to get to,
Yeah.
And a big part of shame is lack of vulnerability, which is so counterintuitive.
Yeah.
When you tell people you want to get rid of that, we'll start talking about the stuff you don't want people to know.
Exactly.
It's like, well, what?
Yeah.
And what was that quote she said?
About the shame?
Yeah.
The more you talk about it, the less you have it.
That's right. So nobody wants to have it, but the less you talk about it, the more you have it.
And the interesting part for me in that is there is a correlation between shame and addiction, if you will.
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
Conversely, there is less, the more a person, I want to separate guilt and shame. I know we've done it probably before, but basically to describe shame, if we're going to describe it, shame basically tells us I am bad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Guilt says I did something bad. So there's a correlation between shame and substance abuse type thing, or addictive behaviors. And there's the opposite correlation between guilt and those addictive behaviors. So the more I understand that I recognize what I've done and what I've hurt, and I'm able to recognize that, I have less tendency towards addictive behavior.
Yeah.
But the more I hold on to that shame, the more tendency I have towards addictive behavior. And I think that's a neat part when you stop and think about it. Not neat in a sense,
and you
but
can deconstruct it that
yeah,
way.
Because what happens is, and I think the word she used, connecting with shame, is worthiness.
Mm-hmm.
So when I can recognize that, it's not necessarily me being perfect, but me being whole. You know what I'm saying? I don't have to have it all together. In our culture, I think there is this I'm going to go right straight to Facebook. I don't mean to, but it gives that perception of perfection.
Right.
I heard a guy the other day who was talking about, man, I realized how terrible my Christmas was because I didn't go on a ski vacation. I didn't go hunting big game animals. It's right. Like I had a terrible Christmas.
Right.
But that's only because everybody's putting forth this perfect type dynamic, and the wholeness isn't there. The authenticity isn't there of the rest of the life.
Yeah.
So that's where I really like that worthiness. And I think, for me, that comes back to being able to be honest with God and recognize, okay, yeah, I make mistakes, but and I sin and I have guilt, but at the same time, because of who God is, he says I'm worthy.
Yeah.
And I think so often, in our family systems, in our childhood, we have these relationships, one or two specifically, that we got the impression that we were terrible. We were bad. Yeah. I am bad. That shame dynamic was translated some way. And it's very difficult to get on the other side of that once it becomes, a habit, a pattern, a cycle, that kind of thing.
Yeah. One of Covey's quotes is you can't, or it might have actually been him quoting Einstein, but you can't solve a problem from the same place you entered it, right?
Sure.
Like you have to be a level above the problem to be able to solve it. And when you grew up in an environment where you didn't feel worthy,
sure,
you're not, typically you're going to need some help.
Sure.
Which is going to require some vulnerability. It's going to require people to speak into your life, to speak above that situation of your unworthiness, to say, no, look, here's why that's not true. I also want to tie back to the vulnerability and shame thing a little bit.
Sure.
It kind of call back all the way back to our conversation about integrity, right? So integrity is aligning who you want to be with who you are.
Sure.
Essentially is a really basic version of it. And what happens is in most addictions is it removes you further and further from who you want to be.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which means your integrity is disintegrating. The further who you are gets from who you want to be. I don't want to be someone who steals from my mom for drug money, right?
Sure.
Well, it started as I don't want to be someone who does drugs this much. Sure. And then it became, I don't want to be someone who's addicted to drugs. And then it became, I don't want to be someone who treats my friends terrible because I have to go take care of my addiction. Like,
sure.
I get out of situation. And then it becomes, I don't want to be someone who steals from my mom for drug money, etc. And your integrity is disintegrating, right?
Sure.
And I think that's so important to understand that shame is a natural byproduct of addiction. It's a natural byproduct of things that are counter to who we want to be.
Sure.
So now if you're someone who's like, my greatest ambition in life is to be a drug addict,
yeah.
I mean, maybe you wouldn't have much shame, right? And there's probably people out there with a little bit of disconnect because of whatever psychological abuse or something that's kind of like, this is good enough for me and I have no problem with this. And they probably don't have much shame in that world. There might be that, but it's very much going to be the minority. The majority is going to be the further addicted you are, the greater the heap of shame in your life because your integrity is disintegrated. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I was as you shared that the third part of that Hersey, that the connection part kind of comes to mind for me, because in reality, in order for me to get the things that I think I want, I would say you have to have connection.
Yeah,
with someone. You follow me? So if I am just
meaningful things.
Yes, but at the same time, if I need something from you, I may have to put on a mask to get what I want from you, to get what I want.
Yeah.
Whether it's, stealing from other people, bringing them close enough to get close enough to steal from them to get what I want, and I was thinking about that in that, the aspect of connection, because that kind of connection is not, it's all about, I'm trying to think of a good word to describe something that's not health. It's use. It's using people.
Yeah.
That's where I want it, and I think that's the difficult part, because if we're gonna be vulnerable, some people at times may even use us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So being able to say, okay, yeah, and that being part of connection, I think that's where I like still thinking about much of that as far as that connection and how we utilize or create connection in such a way that can be reciprocal.
Yeah.
Whereas I think when we look at it for what it is about me, we're not concerned about the reciprocal nature of connection.
Right. And that connection becomes tenuous at best, right?
Yes.
Because as you use people, the less connected they desire to be with
That's
you,
exactly
certainly.
it.
And the less desire you are to be with them, because there's that shame blocking that
Yes.
relationship now too, right? When you steal from your mom, do you want to go home, for Sunday brunch?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? You
Yeah.
probably not.
And then that's just your mom. That doesn't, count the rest of your family, and that, because if you're not there for Sunday brunch, you're likely not connecting with other people in your family and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because that's where the second C was, that compassion. I think we have less compassion for people as we become used as well. So I think it's neat to see, how all of those come together, affecting vulnerability. Yeah. And I think when I like coming back to the other C, when we get vulnerability right, that becomes a source of support. Mm-hmm. Because like we were sharing earlier, that person who's okay being naked, it's like they can share that nakedness and we can say, okay, wow, that must have really hurt. Or when I said that must have hurt your feelings. Now I'm going to be mindful of not saying things that hurt your feelings, because that person was vulnerable and shared what hurt. I'm going to likely come back with a source of support. And I think that's the power of vulnerability. But it's, as humans, I think it's just tough to be able to hold that in a way that's saying, okay, here I am. But unless we are that authentic, wholehearted person, go ahead.
You mentioned it's tough, and it is tough, right? To stay vulnerable enough to present your real self in most circumstances. That's tough.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
What's tougher though is not doing that.
Sure.
But it's not more intuitive. It's more intuitive to not be vulnerable, to kind of present that mask. But the long-term results are always that life is going to be tougher when you when you are not vulnerable and you are not presenting who you truly are.
Sure.
Because maintaining a mask is difficult, and it is a struggle. And even when you do maintain a mask, it can cause, again, going back to integrity, that itself can start to disintegrate your integrity, because when you're maintaining a mask, it's because you're not being that mask, and that's what you want other people to see.
Sure.
So again, you're not aligning those things, and you're not moving towards being that person. You're just putting that up, knowing that I can't be that person, so I have to present it to other people. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Versus letting that mask slip away and say, this is who I really am, and I want to work towards being that version of myself, and actually having to do the work.
Sure.
Instead of assuming people can't see who you really are. They just see that masked version,
Yeah.
And she also talked about, the compassion C.
Sure.
She basically described it such that if you can't, I guess I'm going to use the word forgive, but if you can't accept who you are, and you're continually putting up that mask, the chances that you can accept others how they are is much lower, right? Your chances are very low that you can accept others when you can't accept yourself.
Sure.
And the inverse is beautifully true, right? The more you're able to accept who you are in your imperfection, that I'm whole, despite needing improvement or despite not being perfect, I'm still whole. You can look at others and say, that person is also whole, and they have struggles just like me, and breathe a level of compassion for others but it starts with you.
Sure.
Right?
I would say that's a source of empathy.
Yeah.
That would be the foundation of empathy, is this ability that I have to be able to say, okay, I'm like you, you're like me, and we can hold one another accountable, and yet there's still an acceptance of one another, because I recognize that I make mistakes too. Mm-hmm. We all stumble in many ways. And when I'm able to recognize that, oh, I stumble in this way, and really, just because you're stumbling in a way that I might see myself a little more put together.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I don't stumble.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we can get it mixed up at times, is I just want to hang around people that only stumble the same way I do.
Yeah.
Because then I feel better about myself.
Yeah.
But in reality, I'm creating connection with other people who are just affirming my stumbling.
That's right. And ironically, I've recently read an article that talked about if you look hard enough, the people who are most offended at things are often those things are the things they dislike about themselves the most.
Sure.
So then you have that going on, right?
Yeah. And I along that line, and as you shared on the addiction, I like what she shared about numbing as well.
Yeah.
Because and it's interesting because when we think about it, we do want to kind of segment our lives, and it's like, well, I don't want to be sad. So I tend to suppress my sadness, or I tend to do things that avoid my sadness. But in reality, I am suppressing all emotion to the degree that I suppress any emotion.
Yeah. She said you can't selectively numb emotions.
That's exactly right.
In that context of we want to suppress the vulnerability, the part that makes us embarrassed or gives us pain or
and therefore we numb.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I was having a conversation the other day, and she mentioned it as well. We numb with different things. It can be substance, it can be, but the interesting part is, she talked about the American cohort. America consumes 85% of all antidepressants and anxiety medication. 85% is consumed in the world, is consumed by America.
The American dream, Mark.
Well, it also reminded me when she was talking about indebtedness, obesity, all of these things that we use to numb.
Yeah.
Because we can't just be authentic and we can't feel. And I'm not saying, you can't be in debt, but at the same time, if we're doing these things just to numb, then we just go further and further.
Or a lot of those things, are chicken egg too, right? Like sometimes we use those things to numb, and sometimes by using those, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And again, we talked about addiction can numb us, right?
Sure.
So it can go both ways too, where we use food to numb our emotions, or vice versa.
Right.
We use food and therefore our emotions become numb.
Sure. No, I hear you. Yeah. A source versus an outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, that's a great point when it comes to, because, even our indebtedness can to a degree keep us from connection. Because, I owe, therefore off to work I go, type thing. But yes, that, and that's where I was thinking about it in the context of, things that keep us from connection.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that numbness, the way she shared it in that. Yeah.
The other thing about kind of the American dream, or kind of the way it is right now, is that things are so good. And therefore it kind of creates an expectation that things are good for you, because they're, just like it creates this expectation that we have to be act put together, because we don't have a reason not to be. And I feel like, whether it's other countries, third world countries, or it's previous years of our history, previous centuries of our history, where the struggle was real. Right. And when you and I were out fighting whoever, right, like the French Revolution or whatever, I don't know, the English in the Revolution, you and I were fighting alongside each other. You and I saw each other's weaknesses.
Sure.
And because we didn't want to die, we would cover for each other's weaknesses. Like there was a requirement, or not even a requirement, a reality of vulnerability in struggles.
Sure.
Right. Where there's not enough time to hide that struggle or hide that vulnerability, because I'm too busy focused on this struggle, whatever the struggle it is, getting food on my plate, fighting the Nazis, whatever that struggle is. And right now we're very comfortable. And so it leaves all of our attention on the existential things and makes us think about how we should be perfect and we're not. And I need to hide that from the Joneses, my neighbors, right? Like,
right.
so that I can keep up with appearances. And it's no wonder that we are one of the largest consumers of antidepressants and those things, right? When we're left to our own, thoughts and struggles and
sure.
Yeah. And the struggle's real, whether there's an external struggle or the existential one, but we don't feel like we can talk about the existential one, and that's a big problem in America and in the world.
Well, and I think the great point to what you're saying is when I view myself from a perfection standpoint, okay, if I'm to be perfect, then I have to blame. Because there's a reason, there's a reason why, and that's the reason.
Right.
Because you don't know that I am perfect, but so if you're thinking I'm not perfect, I need to convey to you the reason why you're seeing that part of me. It's because of that other person. It's because I have to do this. You follow me? But if we can, and then I think that's, as she alluded to it in the segment as well, politics. If we're at this point where, I got it all figured out and you're dumb and wrong, well, then here's the blame.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that's where, the aspect of discourse, the ability to say, okay, here's where I'm at, here's where you're at. What can we do about this? Kind of like you were sharing about the two soldiers fighting side by side. It's like, okay, I'm wounded in this way.
Yeah.
How can, there's a vulnerability. How can I need your support in this way because I'm wounded. And we're all wounded. But yet, if I'm more concerned about the fact that you're messy because you're wounded and I'm perfect, so therefore I'm not, I need to distance myself from you. Versus if I'm able to say, okay, your arm hurts, okay, but my leg hurts. Can we work together in such a way that says, we're both getting out of this, or we're both, committing to this regardless.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back a little bit to the compassion conversation, I basically said it starts with us, right? It starts inside. That's, compassion starts there. I'm not sure that's even true because, again, you can't solve a problem from the place you entered it. So if you don't have compassion, it's not as simple as to say, well, just have compassion.
Sure.
Right. And, I'm just thinking about in the context of recovery and hearing other people's stories, how that can breathe compassion into me, into us, right? As we hear other people's stories and go, wow, they had it hard, maybe harder than I had it, you know, and it gives us a sense of compassion for that person, which in turn can start to breathe compassion into myself for myself, right? Like, seeing that change can happen, despite the struggles and being able to relate to the struggles and being able to also then relate to change might be possible for me as well. And I don't know, I just wanted to kind of come back to that to just say, I think it's easy to say it starts with you. I don't think practically it's that simple. I think practically, again, it does require you to go to a position higher than you were, kind of stepping above the problem. And that's, I see hearing other people's stories as a way to do that, as a way to elevate above your current understanding of things.
Yeah.
Is to be able to see life through other people's eyes from their vulnerability,
And I think what you're describing is the power of a group dynamic. It doesn't have to be a group, but, it can be a dyad, just two people. But at the same time, I think there is a power in that group because I see it in multiple ways. And I'm mindful as, we'll do marriage classes and so forth. And it's interesting to see that, that deep breath that, people take when it's like, oh, your marriage has problems too, because it's like there is this perception that we're the only ones that are screwed up. Our relationship is the only one that's this messy. And when we're able to interact in that group and we create that connection and we have compassion for each other, and it takes a level of courage to step into that group, then that's when I'm learning, about empathy and vulnerability. And it's like, it is okay. And I think so often in couples, it's easy to get stuck in that aspect of, well, I'd change, but you have to do this, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, no one wants to go first.
Yeah, because there's a fear of vulnerability, right? In
Sure.
that context of no one wants to go first, there's a fear that if I let down my guard and say I'm sorry, you won't, and I'll be stuck carrying the burden, right? I'll be, whatever this thing is between us, now I'll have to carry it. And next time something similar happens, now I have to carry double the burden because I apologize, and so now you can naturally blame, you know, so there's fear that goes into that.
Because what happens is if I'm vulnerable towards you and it doesn't come back as support, you know, then because that's what we're talking about is cycles and patterns.
Yeah.
So if I'm challenging some of those cycles and patterns and I'm actually being vulnerable and it doesn't come back as support, I'm far less likely to be vulnerable.
So what should you do in that case?
Well, you have to recognize that it's part of a process of change.
Yeah.
You know,
and that the support that can't be your source.
Yeah.
Right? Is that fair?
That's very fair. Because ultimately we have to recognize we're challenging patterns and cycles. And to challenge something, I have to come forward to a certain degree and be able to say, this is what I see and this is what happens. And I think people that do that well, communicate in a way that doesn't convey blame. You know, because so often if we want to use the word you in a statement, we're going to already elicit some defensiveness, which is going to kind of create blame because we're just lobbing at each other. But yeah, if we can come forward and I can say, when I'm noticing that when this happens, I do this. We're identifying a cycle and a pattern. And in that process, this happens next. I see it this way. How do you see that happening? You know, because at that point, I'm not saying you did this and it's all your fault. I'm willing to say I felt disappointed.
Right.
When I stated, you know, I shared that I would like to do this and there was no response.
Yeah. Because you're taking responsibility for your own feelings and not.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if I say, Mark, you made me offended, that's saying the responsibility is on you to fix that.
That's correct.
If they say, Mark, when you said that, I felt offended, there's an implicit understanding that, you know, it's on me to deal with that.
Sure.
I think, depending on the words you use and how, you know, the context.
I typically like to lead with that emotional part that I'm owning, you know, and try to avoid the you in our communications. But that's the basis for it, is the ability to identify that I felt something when something else happened. When this happened, I felt.
And that's also a big reason why, you know, in Celebrate Recovery, we have what we call open share groups, and it's just a support, an environment for support, you know, gender specific support groups where there's not a rule as to what to say, as in you can kind of talk about whatever you want, but there are guidelines as to how it's said.
Sure, exactly.
You know, and one of the things we talk about is there's, you know, I forget which one it's tied to, but we basically encourage them not to use statements like you or we, but instead use statements like I and me.
Exactly.
And so that it reforms your thoughts around your struggles into something that you have to take responsibility for, right? Because we're not interested in your wife's flaws.
Right.
That's not what that support circle environment is for.
Yep.
You know, so if you can reframe that conversation about your wife's flaws in a way that is about you, then okay, now we can get somewhere. Now we can have support for each other. We can build each other up. We can kind of be those two soldiers on the sideline. You know, I'll cover for your broken foot and you cover for my broken arm, kind of thing. But if it's all their fault, you know, it's...
If I can say I lost control when my wife said something to me versus my wife said something to me and therefore I did, you know, it's the difference of blame versus, almost shame and guilt.
Yep.
You know, I am admitting when I use I did something, I felt something, and I'm accepting responsibility for that.
And going back to our word, vulnerability, when you do that, you, Mark, in the circle, and I'm in that circle with you, I go, oh, that's a reframing of how I think about it when my wife makes me lose control, right? Like she does her terrible thing she does, and that's not my fault. When you say it is my fault, I lost control, I have to rethink it and go, And the cool thing about that environment is that you're not preaching at me. You're not saying, it's your fault. You lost control. You shouldn't. Sure. You're saying you're talking about yourself. Exactly. Yeah, you're not talking to me.
Yeah.
You are talking about yourself, and it leaves me free to, or I should say, prevents me from having to put up my defenses or guard my own thoughts from what you're trying to tell me. No, it's not my fault, because if she did it, it's like, no, you're not talking at me.
Sure.
And I think that's just a little plug for any kind of support environment like that, where you're able to share about your own experiences in a vulnerable way.
Sure.
Encouraging people to get involved in environments like that, whether it's a small group that's particularly vulnerable, at your church, or counseling is great as well, although it's not that same vulnerable circle, right? But sure. I think there's aspects to it.
Well, I think that's where, if I may, to build on that, that's where I like the family counseling or group night, because we are able to sit down. Thank you. We are able to sit down, and I'm actually in some ways able to hear you for the first time as we identify, these patterns and cycles that are going on that so often we are just in the midst of reacting to.
Yes.
But when we're able to slow it down and, because there is a third person in the room, with a couple, then we're able to slow it down. It's like, oh, I get it. So you're not just being mean because you like being mean. Your meanness or what you're saying is a reaction, is part of a cycle and pattern of the way that I don't necessarily listen to you.
Right.
So when I ignore you, you need to get louder.
Yep.
Because I'm not hearing, I'm not remembering what you're saying, I'm not valuing what you say. So of course our human response is, well, and I have to get louder.
Yeah.
I have to holler, I have to scream. It's like, no, it's just a part of that cycle and pattern.
And it's kind of a boiling water thing, right? Where the water is getting warmer and warmer, and we're in it, we don't realize it. The frog,
Sure,
the
frog in the pot.
At some point we're screaming and yelling, and you think about the neighbor walking by and you go, holy crap. I'm a monster, like I'm a boiling frog at this point. And I say that from my own personal experience of just like arguments with Megan and over the years, and learning, like, if someone overhears what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, I'm so ashamed. But it wasn't, you talked about the benefit of that group counseling, or the opportunity to hear others speak, or hear your spouse speak in front of a neutral party.
Sure.
And you naturally have to meter your response, because you're not going to do your typical pattern, or it's like instinctual, it sounds like a monster, right?
Sure.
And that's a really great first step, is to be able to get in that environment and start to meter how you respond, and have to choose better words.
Sure.
But it's a whole nother thing for me. There's a few times where I did see that, someone was overhearing, or
sure.
And that was like kind of shocked it into my system. Like, your words are not good.
Yeah.
There's no justifying these words. There's no justifying this tone. Because if you're embarrassed, if someone hears that, that if you looking at that integrity picture, right? The person you want to be is someone who doesn't, someone walking by doesn't think you're a monster.
Sure.
Well, then I can't allow that to continue, and I have to start doing the work. And that, that's a life's work, honestly, because a relationship that close, you're always going to be rubbing each other, good or bad, right? And I'll say I think I'm way better at that. There's very few times where I'm like, I think I would be embarrassed by what, but that took a lot of work.
No doubt.
I say all that to say, like, that environment where you can hear how you would have responded, but no, you can't, can be really healthy to think about, how should I handle this? Because Mark's listening while I talk to my wife, and I don't know, there's something. And then now, like you said, that going back to that loudness thing, Well, now she doesn't need to increase the volume.
Right.
And vice versa. Like, she's going to meet her what she has to say because Mark's listening.
And I think that's when, we're growing in that vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because I would tantamount, vulnerability is almost like softness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm able to be soft with you. I don't have to be harsh. I don't have to be, critical.
Yeah.
I'm not being critical. I'm being, hey, do you see this the same way I do? And it's interesting you bring up a point, because I just had we talked about this with a couple, like, to the degree that the guy gained awareness, if someone else was talking to my wife the way that I'm talking with her.
Oh, it's on.
I can't necessarily repeat what he said, but when he gained that awareness, it's like,
that's
he
that same light
done
bulb,
something
right?
to that person,
right?
Yeah. And yet he started to realize that that's what he's doing to his wife on a daily basis. So it's when we're able to see it that way. Yeah.
And that's such an important word, see, because we don't see it. Like, and you can't start till you start down this road of vulnerability, because it unlocks more vulnerability and continues that path of softness, as you said.
So as a disclaimer, don't enter the path towards vulnerability lightly.
Yes.
Because I like what you just shared in that context. The more vulnerable we become, the more vulnerable we are. Or the more vulnerable we are, the more vulnerable we can become.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difficult part when I have been hurt deeply. Because I see it so often, my desire is to disengage from many things, most things, depending on that level of hurt, because all I want to do is numb. So therefore, no, I don't want to enter into another relationship. It doesn't even have to be another romantic relationship. I don't want anything to do with the relationship. And I think, that's where, and, it's interesting, especially when we can recognize that. I think as adolescents, I'll be honest, Lizzie was the one that kind of shared this with us, and I recognize, she's
the video.
The video, she's, in college, and there's a lot of, connection and disconnection and, and romantic relation, and of course she sees it, and I just really appreciated the dynamic of being able to say, yeah, okay, I'm going to recognize at this point in my life that vulnerability is a part of life. And in order to be healthy, I have to be able to connect. And yet I still have to be able to be aware, kind of a guard your heart type thing that basically says, okay, I'm going to put some vulnerability out there. From a trust dynamic, I'm going to put a little bit out there just to see what you do with it.
Yeah.
Because I think that is, I think that can be countercultural too. I can be so vulnerable that I'm just all in with all of me, and I'm actually kind of being irresponsible.
Yeah.
So I want to, as we're talking about this vulnerability, I want to recognize we're talking about this within the context of healthy relationship.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the context for change. If you're trying to do, I think, I don't want to use your season correctly, so tell me if I get it right. But basically, if you're trying to produce change in a context that's unhealthy, and it's not a context that's healthy for change, it's the same context it's always been, but you're trying to like dump all of this vulnerability out into this thing. There's a good chance that vulnerability could turn into leverage for that environment, like if it's an unhealthy environment. And you certainly don't want that, right? Isn't that?
Yeah. And that's why the 3 C's are connected, because that first C is about safety.
Yeah. So I was just going back to your tread lightly. I was going back to that, because if you're going to enter this process, and it is a process, vulnerability, it doesn't stop.
Exactly.
Right?
It's a pathway.
Yes.
Yes.
If you're going to start down that pathway, you need to do it in a safe way. You need to do it in a proper context for change, where change can happen safely, right?
Exactly. And then, but still, even in that, so often that safety is defined by me and where I came from. And so to challenge that, sometimes I have to get all the way down to the third C, which is consolidation. And that's a fancy way of saying learning. So sometimes what I've learned initially in my family system is safe may not necessarily be safe. You know, if I've learned alcoholism is safe, and that's a good way to numb and avoid, that's going to create challenge. You know, I'm going to have to challenge some of those patterns and cycles. And then I'm going to get to the third C, which is consolidation. And I have to learn that, okay, what I viewed as safety really may not be safe for me. So I think, you know, that's where, and each C is able to connect to the next one, or, you know, I'm able to go back to it. So if I start challenging patterns and cycles and we're becoming vulnerable, but the wheels fall off, I have to go back to the other C and creating a context for change, which is about safety. Okay, we're good. Are you know, I want to, because once we start challenging some of this stuff, it's easy to become reactive. And then if it becomes reactive, then we have to go back because, you know, there's nobody's going to change. Nobody's going to be vulnerable to it if there's not a certain level of safety from my perspective.
Yeah. If you think about too, when it comes to, I mean, I think it's good to talk about the quote unquote danger of vulnerability at the same time that we're talking about the value of it, because I think it's important to be careful with it, especially as you learn. But you can think of, you know, probably some of the people who struggle the most with vulnerability, there's a good chance that there was an effort at it at some point that got met with, you know, that vulnerability was smashed. Right. And, you know, someone took that vulnerability and ran with it and leveraged it, or, you know what I mean?
Sure. And in some ways, it kind of brings to mind what you shared about the level up dynamic, because I think there is a aspect where if I am at a certain point, or let's just say I'm at a certain socioeconomic level, I'm going to have a little more room to be vulnerable to people who may use me, and I'm still going to be okay.
You got some cushion. Yeah,
I do have some cushion. And I think, you know, it's when we're at the same level, you know, that it becomes difficult. And I have no issues with people being cautious, because I think it does. I think whether a person is trustworthy, or to the degree a person is trustworthy, affects my ability. And if I'm able to move that relationship along slowly, I'm actually able to define, okay, yes, I can be vulnerable based on your response, but I'm not necessarily being irresponsible in just saying, hey, I'm going to give all of this to you and you do with it as you see fit. And like I say, I'm willing to wrestle with that as a personal viewpoint, you know, and you can challenge me on that or anything, you know, if it seems like it's counter to vulnerability. But at the same time, I think there is a vulnerability, but I'm also being a steward. Yeah.
It's wisdom, right?
I have to, I'm okay with it being wisdom, but I'm also able to say, okay, if you want to challenge part of that, I'm willing to talk about that.
Challenge what specifically?
My viewpoint, my specific viewpoint on how we can be vulnerable and still be cautious.
No, I think I agree with that viewpoint. So it's going to be hard for me to challenge it, you know, but I think there's, I mean, we started out really trying to talk about the value of vulnerability, and this is what this episode is about. At the same time, I think you and I both recognize the danger of vulnerability in the wrong contexts, and even in the wrong mindset. Or like, if your goal is, well, if I'm vulnerable, it'll fix everything. Again, you're going to be, you're going to find out some stuff. Vulnerability does not fix anything. If anything, it can make things worse, right?
Sure.
Depending on, again, the context.
And that's the part that I wanted to create. I wanted to create a caution to say, hey, if you're entering into this, it's going to be difficult because you're going to be more vulnerable. But at the same time, do it in a way that's safe, because otherwise you're just hurting yourself and that kind of thing.
And I would say the most important aspect to having a safe environment is having, someone's that is already further down the journey.
Sure.
Who are able to model it for you, and when you do it, are able to kind of commend it and encourage it and not stomp on it,
Yes.
And that can be a counselor, right? I would encourage counseling if you're unable to be vulnerable. That's a great, I think, good step. But also, finding environments. We talk about Celebrate Recovery a lot, and there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. It is in my opinion, nearly perfect context for change, right? Because we're creating an environment that is safe and that is not judgmental and that accepts and that simply demonstrates, here's how it looks in my life and here's how it looks in your life, and there's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I would encourage something like that, but support groups, people who are working on their own vulnerabilities in front of you, and you can do the same thing. But definitely, I think it's important to seek out opportunities and relationships where vulnerability is encouraged and modeled and reciprocated.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I think as you were sharing, vulnerability is a worthy gift.
Yes.
It's worth pursuing, and I think it is a gift that we have to be able to give to others, and like all good gifts, they're reciprocal. Mm-hmm. And so as you were sharing there, it's like, it's a gift to be able to be vulnerable in a situation that I can understand, what vulnerability really is, and it's safe to do so. Mm-hmm. So appreciate you sharing, Justin. Well, that's how we see it.
Thanks. Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like how I see it, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.